Hello, I'm Nathan Bond. Welcome to Impact Factor, a seminar series that explores what research universities do, what's expected of their faculty, and what sort of changes we could expect if we became a research university. As you probably know, Texas State University was designated by the state of Texas as an emerging research university in 2012. That means that we will eventually apply to the state for full research university status. If we become a research university, we'll have an easier time attracting even better students and faculty. We borrowed the term impact factor for our series title because that term is used to measure the scholarly influence of academic journals. And research university faculty are generally required to place their publications in high impact factor rated journals. So, what would Texas State be like if it became a research university? How would things change? What would the regents expect of our faculty? This seminar series is designed to answer those questions. And to do this, we'll bring you one seminar each month during the fall semester. I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Tom Grimes, Professor of Journalism and Mass Communication, who will introduce today's seminar. Tom?
Thank you, Nathan. Okay, here's a question no one has ever asked before. What is art? Well, perhaps a less frequently asked version of the question is, what is art in terms of what will get you both tenure and promotion at Texas State University? And once we've answered that question, let's expand the discussion. Can really good artists thrive in the regimentation of this huge state university? Could the notorious bad boy Jackson Pollock thrive here? How about that splendid contrarian Georgia O'Keeffe? Or the morose Mark Rothko? How about a mercurial performing artist, such as Kathleen Battle? That is, are the greatest artists not academic material? And if so, what are we to infer about artists who work well in the academic environment? Well, here to discuss these issues are two artists and a person who thinks about artists. Johanna Farso is an associate professor of studio art. Joey Martin is a professor of music and director of choral activities at Texas State University. And Craig Hanks is a professor and the chairman of the Department of Philosophy. Professor Hanks studies art and artists among his many other scholarly endeavors. Professor Farso, you and I were in a meeting earlier this week. And you mentioned in that meeting that one of your colleagues got the Pollock-Krasner Prize, right?
Correct.
And that's referring to Jackson Pollock and his wife, Lee Krasner, which brings to mind the question, could Jackson Pollock or Lee Krasner survive in a place like this? Could they serve on the parking committee? Could they serve on the faculty senate? Could they adapt to the customs and habits of the academy?
I think one way to answer that would be, I have no idea how they would do. But I think another way to answer that question would be to look at the creative landscape in this time and to acknowledge that many of the most influential artists of the second half of the 20th century, reflecting the growth of art programs across the country, are affiliated with higher education, affiliated with universities. And I think that is indicative of several things. One of them being the professionalizing of the art world in general, and universities sort of reflecting that. So you see it's a much more competitive field, and it's a much more visible field than at any other time in the past. You know, museum attendance, the role of the artist within society, I think, has gained a lot of prominence. And because of that, you also see artists being asked to fulfill certain kinds of professional roles that maybe they wouldn't have been asked in the past. So, I think that the proliferation of university art programs and how many important current artists are attached to those programs reflects a closer alliance between academia and the art world than in any other time in the past. You also see a lot of the most important artists of the 20th century, like we were talking previously, Gerhard Richter or Joseph Beuys or Kara Walker or Anne Hamilton. All of those people are or were incredibly influential teachers. But having said that, I do think there is a really interesting discussion that extends even beyond the artists to teaching in a more broader sense of where does creativity exist, how do you foster that, and I don't know, it is challenging.
Well, Professor Martin, somebody like Richard Rogers, Rogers and Hammerstein, Rogers and Hart, Richard Rogers, the great Richard Rogers, he worked well on a deadline and in a constrained environment where he had to produce. So there are certain people who do well in this sort of environment.
Of course, part of our art and what we do is often based on structure and symmetry. And so it's helpful when we do have structures at times. And even independent artists who are working on commissions are dealing with a timeline. It may be self-imposed timelines. And even artists who are being contracted for an opera, they come with a role prepared or they're not hired again. I found it interesting that you mentioned Kathleen Battle, and the question may be, would Kathleen Battle fare very well in a higher institution of education? Well, it's quite possible that personality would not, but a comparable artist, Renee Fleming, certainly would. And that is an artist who is called to be an artist teacher, giving back to teaching. So some artists just don't have the temperament to be teachers, but many great artists feel a calling to share what they know. And I think Renee Fleming's an excellent example of that.
An artist I had some contact with when I was in television news full-time was Henry Moore, the British sculptor. He did a big piece for Dallas City Hall back in '76 or about that time. I did a long interview with him, and he seemed to me to be a very orderly and thoughtful person who could account for himself in a classroom, probably. So there are such people. Craig, when I was an undergraduate, I took an art course because I had to. And the professor of art had created a sculpture out of wood, or I guess you'd call it a sculpture. He used a chainsaw and sculpted this thing. And he got it in his pickup truck and took it out into a forest and left it there, where no one would see it. He was presenting it to the universe, to the earth, to the world. And none of us had to see it for it to have value. And even as a little 20-year-old, I thought to myself, well, that's the most useless expenditure of time and effort I can think of. Surely there are certain larger parameters that exist in the abstract that motivate that define what we would call art, right or wrong?
Well, I'm not going to try to offer any definitive account of what counts as art. But I guess I would say that the example you're giving actually does have an audience. And you were part of that audience.
Correct.
Right? And we're now part of that audience. Right? So there are lots of ways of defining what the arts are, but one of the functions is to provoke a different range of experiences and thoughts than we might have otherwise. Right? And so that very piece and telling the class about it automatically serves that function. Right? And so you're actually still thinking about the meaning of that piece of art decades later. So that strikes me as particularly powerful, right? In a way that sometimes even quite public pieces that sort of fade into the background might not be noticed as much. So.
Professor Martin, what if a faculty member, an untenured assistant professor, was in the habit of producing such art, put in a forest, put at the bottom of a lake, where it can't be exhibited, it can't be juried, it can't be assessed, but it provokes the kind of now 40-year-old, 50-year-old discussion I just had with Craig. That might work on some level, but when you're in the dean's, you're an associate dean in the College of Fine Arts and Communication, and you're assessing tenure and promotion cases, that ain't going to cut it, is it? To put it in the bottom of Lady Bird Lake and say, I'm making a statement.
Well, this may be a question that's better addressed to Joanna because she's very familiar with what the criteria are for tenure and promotion in the College of Fine Arts and Communication, especially in the art and art design. But in the scenario that you just demonstrated, usually there are clear criteria that determine what tenure or promotion. Yet at the same time, there is a subjective quality when it comes to the arts, whereas one may say that tenure promotion is agreeable and grantable if you have the average of one juried article in a peer-reviewed journal in your content area. When it comes to the arts, there's a big variance, and I found this when Joanna and I were serving together on the TK20, of getting an idea of what is tenurable, what things in each of the visual and performing arts, and it's slightly different. I think what we are looking for is that people have demonstrated that they have an expertise or recognized as an expertise in an area. And those are sometimes hard to quantify or even qualify because it is a little subjective. And one of the good things about the College of Fine Arts and Communication is it is left to each of the units to determine that. But both Joanna and I have the same problem in that we have a group of colleagues who have a very diverse background. So what it really then comes down to is, do they meet the criteria of having a national or an international reputation? It may be that they do have a national or international reputation with their art at the bottom of Lady Bird Lake. If it, in this scenario that we constructed here, from your teacher, actually shows that there is breadth. But the best thing is we leave it to the experts in the area to determine what that criteria is.
Well, let me turn the question a bit. Think back when you were an untenured assistant professor. Did you feel a bit constrained? I've got to get this done and that done, and after I get tenure, I'll feel less bound.
I would say yes and no. I mean, in a certain sense, the mission of the artist/academic doesn't change when they enter a university context, because I sort of think of there are three roles of the artist researcher. The first is the making of the work, which is the most mystical element of the equation, something that's hardest to pin down. The second is the recognition of that work, which any artist being hired at a university is already someone that values being a participant in the cultural landscape and getting recognition for that participation. The third thing, which I think is the area which we're actually talking about, is how do you then translate that recognition into an academic context so that there's an appreciation of the scope of recognition and the scope of impact. And I think one of the things that we have tried to do in our department, with the guidance of Michael Niblett, who's our director, is really try to create narratives that illuminate what a certain exhibition space means in terms of peer review and peer recognition. Or if your work is reviewed in a certain publication, what is the reputation and nature of that publication? What's the nature and reputation of the person reviewing your work? So it does become more nuanced in a sense in terms of how a tenure track faculty is evaluated in terms of their impact and relevance and recognition of their research. But those first two elements, the making of the art and the recognition of it, that didn't change at all once I started teaching. I would say a couple of things changed, which is just that you are asked to become kind of a master of time management in terms of letting a new part of your job enter the equation, that you're doing service and that you're teaching. But in terms of those other things, there's not much of a change. I think being in a university environment does present the possibility of collaborations between disciplines that might not happen otherwise. But that's more of a positive than a negative.
Professor Hanks, let me ask you this question. Well, there's a lot of literature out there right now on the internet and in the popular press about the quote-unquote outrages of hip-hop, rage rock, just the nastiness of it and the antisocial quality of it. Is that a necessary, in a way, requisite for avant-garde art? I recall that urinal that was produced by that artist in 1917. I can't remember his name. Duchamp. That urinal that sold, it seems like a couple of years ago or 10 years ago, for millions of dollars. It's an iconic piece from the 20th century. Outrageous for 1917. Hip-hop, outrageous for 2015. Foul, disgusting. Isn't that inextricably bound into what constitutes art?
I guess I'd say three things. I don't think hip-hop is the least bit controversial in 2015. It's now, 35 years on the, or 40 years on the cultural landscape.
You look at the Republican Party and the people running for president, they tend to...
But, I mean...
Or my mother.
Or your mother.
But, we remember the days of, the Parents Music Resource Center and Tipper Gore and, right. So this is, and before that there were other versions of this. That the arts might challenge forms of existing thought, experience, and perception doesn't strike me as new, right? If you look at someone like Goya, or going back even to, say, Michelangelo, right? Ways of portraying the human form that were striking and challenging to the perceptions of the time. So that doesn't strike me as particularly new. Artists have often played that kind of function, but not only that kind of function, right? So artists have always existed within institutions, right? So Velázquez was a court painter, right? Frau Angelico lived in a friary and then in the Vatican, right? And the roles they were playing were not to try to provoke, right, outrage, right? But nonetheless, they produced amazing work. They existed within complex institutions and had a lasting impact. So I'm not sure that I've directly answered the question about what are we to make of perhaps the more culturally controversial forms of music today, other than I guess I would say it looks like, at least I'll draw on my own discipline, going back 2,500 years, the elders have been concerned about what the young people are doing, right? And so Socrates was put to death because young people were asking too many questions under his influence. So it strikes me that it is not at all unusual that that kind of controversy is part of the culture.
I want to pursue this line of questions, but first we want to take a quick break, refresh ourselves, and we'll be right back. Tom Grimes here. Let me quickly reintroduce my guests on this edition of Impact Factor. Johanna Farso is an associate professor of studio art. Joey Martin is a professor of music and director of choral activities at Texas State. And Craig Hanks is the department chair in the Department of Philosophy and a professor of philosophy. Let me try this from another end, and anybody can answer this. Is there an advantage for an artist, an iconoclastic person, to locate in a place like this rather than in a gallery in a mall or outside a structured environment like this? Can a place like this actually promote creativity?
I would say yes on a number of fronts. Again, sometimes no. But one way, for a lot of artists, the stability of being in a university environment where you're not held subject to the market is a really creatively exciting place to be, because you can take actually more risks than you maybe could if you were only dependent on the sales of your work. So in that way, yes. And in that way, I think the university is serving its role as a cultural hub, as a place that sort of challenges dominant cultural norms and pushes the conversation forward. So I would say, I mean, of course, there are potential benefits to working outside of an institution, but I would also say that I know a lot of professors actually benefit from the teaching part of the equation as well, that being amongst those younger artists that are challenging creative and cultural norms helps to continue to evolve their own practice as artists.
I guess there is a teaching, well, I guess, certainly there is a big teaching component that can, in and of itself, fulfill the role of the university. Although you can't just teach, Professor Martin. I mean, you got to produce and in your own way exhibit, right? I mean,
well, of course, but I think it's also important to remember most of us came here, most of us applied here, if not all of us, because of two things. We are artists, and second, we feel called to share and to teach. We are artist teachers. We're not just artists, and we're not just teachers. We're really a hybrid. And so there are some artists who I don't think ever feel called to a university environment. And then there are those of us who do, so we fulfill that. The other side, and I'd like to add to the beautiful answer that Joanna gave, is that one of the beauties of a university is just that word university, that there is such a culture and a large congress of artists and intellects where even greater art can often be achieved through the combination and the learning and the sharing that goes on. In my particular area, being a director of choral activities, really my art is to conduct, to wave my hands, though it can be quite beautiful, and I hope it is at times. It really requires that very important component of an ensemble, a collection of other artists, equal artists, for whom I'm the conduit for another kind of art to occur. That is not something that's easy to do by self. If my art were completely reliant on just me, it'd be impossible for that to occur. But because I do need the collection of artists, as conductors do, or stage directors, or other actors, it's important that we have this opportunity of the congress of people to have great art occur.
well, let me not defame artists in general in what I've said so far. I'm reminded of some film historians who marked the petulance and the unpredictability of the film actor to James Dean and the Actors Studio of the great Lee Strasberg, because they disrupted things. They didn't show up on time. I mean, Marilyn Monroe, a graduate, if there is such a thing, of the Artist Studio, of the Strasberg Studio, was a good example of didn't show up for several days. We got to halt the production. I wonder if if that kind of tempestuousness and tendentiousness is part of the art itself. If people learn how to behave like that as artists, or is that just a vile stereotype that I'm engaging in here?
Well, I mean, I would say, Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor of California, or Kate Blanchett is the director of Sydney's most important theater company. So the full gamut is realized, but I think it points towards the kind of stereotypes that we then gravitate to kind of strengthen those stereotypes. So when we think of actors, do we immediately gravitate towards the ones that most likely fill what we're most familiar with?
Right. If I were an untenured assistant professor interviewing here, and I'm engaged in the fine or performing arts, do you, as an associate dean, have anodyne words of advice you always give anyone who passes through on a job interview with regard to tenure and promotion?
Well, my position as associate dean is not directly related
Correct.
to
Right.
to the supervision of faculty, but I am a mentor, and one of the beautiful things that I think we do effectively here in many areas at Texas State is we have mentoring for our faculty. When they come in, I remind them that they're here because we respect that they've been chosen to be here from their application and the body of work that they've done. So continue to hold to that. Really believe in what it is that you do, and then use the resources that are available, and there are many available to us, to support what it is that they would like to do, but to find their path to tenure and promotion. And I really feel this is important, that is true to them. I had a way that I approached my tenure promotion. I think every one of my colleagues do. And though we have many similarities, it should be true to what they want and how they wish to achieve tenure promotion. And by following our guidelines, in the School of Music we have very clear guidelines, and they're open just enough, quite a bit, I wouldn't say just enough, so that it can be individual to the person. So two voice teachers might find two different paths to tenure and promotion. They may be similar, but again, very different and unique to them. So my courage is for them to hold to that which brought them here and cling to it through their tenure process.
A few years ago, there was a study published under the title How Professors Think. It was by Michelle Lamont, who's at Harvard. And what she was interested in was the way different disciplines review their materials and their peers. And it's quite clear that different disciplines do exactly what you were describing, right? So if we were in the natural sciences, there'd be a different set of standards that have evolved as those disciplines have matured, right? And the arts have their own kinds of conversations about that as well. And so you don't expect identical ways of thinking, right? But you have similar kinds of community processes that develop the standards, and then they get interpreted by the people as people go through the process. And that seems, quite normal.
If this isn't true, dismiss it instantly. But is there could you construct a dividing line between artists who are also teachers, who just have it in them, and artists who are so iconoclastic they can't organize themselves well enough to teach and don't want to teach?
I wouldn't say that would be the line, because there are some artists that were, I think of someone like Philip Guston, who, an incredibly influential painter, an amazing teacher, but a very neurotic, intense, relatively dysfunctional person in other elements of his life, like his family life or that kind of thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, artists that are highly functional socially are also always great teachers, and then on the other side there's some other kind of model. I think that the full range exists. It's really hard to, especially with the art world now, because so many. We just had someone talking in our department who his artwork focuses around social practice and community, and his background is as a social worker. That was his training before he became an artist. And so in terms of how people identify as artists and what their work constitutes, the range is kind of infinite.
Now you're leading me into a question I must ask. It's an obligatory question, and that is there a certain kind of art that the state of Texas just will not abide? And I'm thinking about sexually oriented art that what is the name of that artist, that photographer? Mapplethorpe. Could a Robert Mapplethorpe prosper and survive at Texas State University?
I'd like to think so.
Yeah, I would too.
Really? I mean, really?
Yes.
The state of Texas would, I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying the state of Texas would tolerate it?
I think that's what a research university means, is that it creates a safe space for really innovative research that challenges.
And we would do that.
I would hope so.
I would hope so. And it's almost the clear definition of academic freedom, that they pursue the art that they value and is of value. Hopefully we could do that.
And then, it's kind of like the earlier question about the importance of hip hop, in the sense of not all hip hop is created equal. And when you look at Mapplethorpe's work, there are elements of it that are really challenging, but he's also been incredibly important on a number of levels in terms of thinking about the human body and thinking about masculinity and thinking about gender and ideas of beauty. And so, I consider him to be one of the most important artists of the last
But
20,
he could
30 years.
thrive here if, well, he's not alive now, but I mean, if he were, he could thrive here.
I can't think about anything in our structure that would imply he couldn't survive. In fact, I think we have the checks and balances to allow for that. Maybe I'm idealistic, but
it works. I mean, it would, that sort of thing is
I would think so. Yeah.
I think it's hard to think about a specific personality and a specific artist. To me, the question makes more sense when it's focused on the work being produced. Like, could that work have relevance in this environment? And in that case, yes, completely. If you read about Mapplethorpe's life, and then you could have a million attitudes of whether he would like living in Texas or not. But but I think it's
for sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously questions about the structure of higher education as it's related to state funding and state oversight. And I think those are both, those are obviously relevant to what we do internal at Texas State. But one of the interesting things about the modern, at least public university in the U.S., is there's a kind of relative autonomy from the direct political process. And we see places where politicians are wanting to sort of reach in, right? North Carolina, Wisconsin being two examples that come to mind in this last year. But without doing that, right, there are mechanisms here for protecting the work of iconoclastic and inventive and challenging people, whether they be scientists or artists. And there are people here who would push back, right? And I'm not sure how the political conversation in the state would fall out. There are still a lot of people who want to support universities as creative places, even if they don't support the particular items that people are producing.
I could see a Grandma Moses doing quite well at a university. You remember her from the early 1960s. But is being iconoclastic, when you look at academic units, is that a piece of what a good artistic academic unit is? You can have a Grandma Moses here who's not going to offend anyone and who's charming and quaint, but does there need to be some disruptive figure in a well-rounded, advanced department of art of some sort?
if it's disruption for the sake of disruption, no, there's not value in that. But if it is something that challenges us to greater art or to broader thinking, then I think there is a place for it.
I think the question also points towards what's the relevance of the research being done. You know, how is the work being created reflecting, challenging the culture at large? There was and I'm paraphrasing, but there's a Richard Serra quote that said that artists don't answer questions, they make problems, which I love, and I tell my students that.
Yes,
so, you know, in that sense, this idea of someone being disruptive as a problem maker can be a real force of creativity.
But it's got to have a teleology to it. I mean, it's got to go somewhere, right? You can't just be difficult for the sake of it.
Hopefully not.
Right.
Just because you are.
And in the sense of posing a question, it strikes me that the creative arts, art history, all of the academic disciplines, actually, that's what we do, right? It's what philosophers do, it's what physicists do, it's what painters and sculptors and dancers do, right? They pose questions. And
we pose the questions so that it provides the opportunity for people to think and ask the questions inwardly, so that we're not really posing questions for an answer specifically. We're posing the question because we want to encourage the broadening of minds, and you come to your answer on that. Not, this is great art because I say this is. Right. You look at it and you determine why it's great art. You struggle with those questions. Why is this a valid performance? Why is it an engaging performance? We should herald that.
Right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming by. I appreciate it. We're out of time now, but thank you so much, Professor Farso, Professor Martin, Professor Hanks.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Impact Factor.